This is about David and Mephibosheth. So David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There's still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lo-debar." So King David had him brought from Lo-debar to the house of Machir, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth." "At your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table just like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet.
Very good. Mephibosheth. What's that? That was a lot. Yeah, it says it over and over again. I'm going to say Mephibosheth. I'm probably going to mispronounce it many times, but it's Mephibosheth. Yeah, no, it could be Mephibosheth too. I'm going with Mephibosheth, but just because that's what I've sort of drilled into my head. But I'm quite sure I'm going to mess it up nonetheless. Familiar story? Not so familiar? This is one of the more obscure stories, and yet, I think it's one of the best stories of the life of David. And I think that as king, now, David and Goliath is one of the great stories of David too, but it's before David becomes king. With David as king, I think this might be his greatest moment. This whole thing with Mephibosheth. Now, next week, we're actually going to cover David's worst moment, but we'll leave that until next week. This week, we're looking at the very brightest side of King David. Now, the other thing that I want to give you a heads up about with this particular passage, this account of David's life, is that it has some definite allegorical application as well. We have here something of an ideal of David. King David in an ideal sort of presentation here. He represents more here than just Israel's current king. David represents a type or an ideal that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And Mephibosheth, he also represents more than just himself. And we'll step more into that towards sort of the middle end part of this message. But by way of setting us up for that ending, let me just give you a little tiny editorial here about a key thing about the Christian faith. I want to straight up here remind us about something having to do with the Christian faith. And that is that the Christian faith, the Christian life, and you've heard this before, it is not primarily about us. Okay? That's going to play heavily into this message. The Christian life is not primarily about us. And I know that that is sometimes a bit of a shock to us in our culture, which is predominantly an egocentric sort of culture that really does want to and often does put us at the center of it. But it's the truth. It's the truth. At least if one takes the scriptures at all seriously, it's the truth that the Christian life is really not about us. Our Christian lives are not about us becoming better Christians. They're not about us developing a deeper life. They're not about us fulfilling our potential or getting in on God's blessing. It's not about us finding our gifts and doing great things with them. It's not about us getting a handle on better or right principles of life to live by. That's not what it's about. Now, the Christian life, it has us in it, all right? And we're a part of it. And some of those things that I mentioned may well happen in our Christian life and do, but it's not about that. Do you know what I mean? That's not what it's about at its core. The Christian life is about God at its core and not us. It's His story that we're joining, not our story that we've invited Him into. We are not, so here's the thing is, if you're an English major of any kind, you'll understand this. We are not the subject of the Christian life, nor are we even the action of the Christian life. We're neither the noun nor the verb of even our own Christian lives. God is. God is both the subject and the predicate of our Christian lives. And that, man, that is very important for us to continue to work at getting and understanding throughout our lives of faith. I think it's something that we actually need to learn kind of over and over again and realize and reinforce in our lives and acknowledge and remember over and over again, because we tend to slip out of that realization. It's about God at its core, not about us at its core. What we are in the story is not the noun, we're not the verb, you know what we are? We're the preposition. We are the preposition. That little word, little but powerful word in a sentence, right? That connects things to one another. That word of relation forming and relation connecting. We are, you see, here's what we are. We are God with us. We're the with. With. God with us. God's the subject. We're the predicate. With. Right? Sorry, not the predicate, the preposition. We're the preposition, that connecting word. It's Christ in me. It's God for us. You see, it's not that we're unimportant or excluded in any way. We are important. We are included. We're just not the subject. We're just not what it's all about. God's what it's all about. It's His story, and we're brought into it in connection to Him in the story. That's how it works. And it's important that we hang on to that. And this story actually teaches us a lot about that. So with that little introduction, let me step into this story. Now, this is not actually the only place where Mephibosheth is found in the story of David and in Scripture. There's actually 3 significant places where Mephibosheth appears. If you want to find Mephibosheth in his first occurrence, you have to actually back up to chapter 4. Of 2 Kings. And what's happening in chapter 4 of 2 Kings is that King Saul and his son Jonathan are both dying. That's the battle in which Saul took his own life, and the battle in which all of his sons as warriors died in a battle against the Philistines. That's where we first learn about Mephibosheth. So what happened was the Israelites lose this devastating battle at the hands of their arch enemies, the Philistines, and there's great panic in the land of Israel, right? Especially in the royal household of Saul, as Saul kills himself and dies, and all of his sons are dead. Obviously, there's panic now as word gets back to them that that's happened. But it's more than just that. You see, the Philistines, in attacking Israel and winning overwhelmingly that battle, they just didn't stop there. They don't just win the big battle and go home. They go on to pillage the rest of Israel, plunder. You know, the wealth of battle is now theirs. They get to now run unharnessed through the country and just ransack the place and take everything of value. Now, if you're going to ransack a country, where are you going to find the most value? Well, you're going to find it in the royal household, right? In the household of the king. That's where the most value is going to be found. So this is where the enemy's headed for. They're going to ransack the capital city. They're going to ransack the house of Saul, which contains so much of the wealth of the country. And when word gets to the house of Saul that this is what has happened and the Philistines are on their way, there is panic. Panic ensues, and they all begin to what? What would you do? Flee. Exactly. They all flee. Like in panic, they flee. And Jonathan has a son whose name is Mephibosheth. And here's what it says in chapter 4, verse 4 of 2 Samuel. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came to Bezreel, where they lived. And that is the news about their death and their destruction and the oncoming armies of the Philistines. His nurse picked him up and fled, obviously. But as she hurried to leave, he fell and became crippled. That's how he became crippled. It was in their flight. It was in their panic. It doesn't really describe exactly what happened, other than that there was some obviously really traumatic fall, and maybe the nurse was carrying him and fell with him and landed on his legs. I don't know, but it seems to have somehow broken both legs, and in the flight, there's no opportunity to set them or anything, and he ends up a cripple for the rest of his life. And that passage in chapter 4, verse 4 says, at the very end, his name was Mephibosheth. From that time on, Mephibosheth spent the next 20 years in hiding, living in a fairly obscure village, keeping his identity secret. You see, it was a pretty risky thing to be the direct blood descendant of an now ousted monarchy, because that's what happened. This was the fall of the house of Saul. If the house of Saul were still in power, you see, it would have been Mephibosheth who would have been in line to become king. His father would have been king, only his father had died, so he would have been in line. With all of Saul's sons dead, it would go to the grandson, who is Mephibosheth. Now, it was common practice in those days, during that era, that when one monarch, the house of David, overtook another monarch, the house of Saul, well, the typical thing that would normally happen during those days is that the new king would make sure that he wiped out everybody from the previous royal family. It was their way of making sure there was no competition and no doubt as to which family we're going to go with. Make sure they're all wiped out, or this might come back and bite you later on as someone, at some point in time says, well, there's still people from the lineage of Saul, and maybe we should consider them as the next king. To make sure that didn't happen, well, common practice was to actually wipe out the previous ruling family. And it happened for centuries beyond that. If you read British history, it happens constantly in their monarchy as well. So this is now the second time that we come across Mephibosheth. With that history of first meeting him, 20 years later, this is where we see him for the second time. And Mephibosheth is now an adult. This is like some 20 years later. And David, he recalls this promise. This is very early in David's kingship. And he recalls this promise that he made with his closest of friends, Jonathan, who was King Saul's son and Mephibosheth's father. And David, if you back up to the stories of Jonathan and David in 1 Samuel, you see that David made this unfailing promise, covenant really, with Jonathan, that he would extend unfailing kindness to both Jonathan and to his descendants. In fact, he didn't just do it with Jonathan, he did it with all of Saul's descendants. This unfailing kindness, he promised, this covenant kind of promise to his closest friend that he would extend unfailing, I want to just highlight unfailing kindness to his descendants. In other words, no matter what, kindness to his descendants. So particularly for Jonathan's sake and that covenant that he made, David wants to fulfill the promise, if he still can, if there is in fact any descendants left, because he knows most of them were killed. So he calls Ziba, who was a former servant of Saul's whole household, and he asks him, is there anybody left? I want to make good on this covenant promise? Is there anyone left? And he says, well, there's one. There's one left from the house of Saul who you could show this God's kindness to. And Ziba goes on to tell him who it is. It's the son of Jonathan. He's still alive. But then he kind of notes, but he's crippled in both feet. You might not even really want him around. He's of no consequence. He's of no threat to you. But that's not what David cares about. That's not what David's worried about here or concerned about here. He doesn't ask how badly he's injured. He doesn't care about where it happened or how it happened. All he says is, bring him to me. There's one left. Bring him to me. I want you to bring him to me. So Ziba goes and he gets Mephibosheth and he brings him to David. And as I was sort of reading through this, I'm wondering what Mephibosheth is thinking when he's being summoned by the king. He's found out now. He's no longer living in security. He's been found out and he's been summoned to come to the king. And I wonder what he's thinking. I can only imagine what he's thinking. And there must be a great deal of fear. There must be a lot of sort of swirling feelings. There must be a sense of, this might be it for me. I might be done. And he's also obviously thinking, but why does he want me? I'm no threat. I'm a nothing. In fact, his fear is reflected right here in the passage. It is because David even says to him, when he finally arrives, David says to him, don't be afraid. Well, why would David say don't be afraid other than the fact that he's obviously afraid? And he's trying to subdue those fears. Don't be afraid. And Mephibosheth, he clearly recognizes that he's an enemy of the house of David. I mean, the house of Saul treated David horrifically when Saul was still alive, chased him for years, tried to kill him numerous times. And Mephibosheth recognizes that I'm representing that. I'm an enemy of the house of David. I could be a threat to him. He even refers to himself as a dead dog, which gives you a pretty clear idea of where Mephibosheth and how he views himself. And I guess that Mephibosheth must have been extremely shocked when he heard what David had to say to him and why he wanted to summon him. Very shocked indeed. The last thing Mephibosheth could have been expecting was that David wanted to show kindness and love towards him, that he summons him out of obscurity just to show kindness and love toward him. He's probably expecting to be executed, or at the very least locked up forever. And even when David says, don't be afraid, I want to show you kindness, Mephibosheth, I rather think there was still a little bit of suspicion in him, worried and wondering, why, really? I mean, part of this probably seems to be too good to be true, and when something seems to be too good to be true, it usually is. And I can't imagine that there wasn't some of that going through his mind. But here's the thing, as time goes on, as the events unfold, David doesn't only speak words of love and kindness, he follows it up by incredible actions of love and kindness as well. To a shocking degree, really. He restores all of the lands that belonged to his grandfather, King Saul, back to Mephibosheth now, which must have made him an suddenly extremely wealthy person. He assigns Ziba and his whole household, and there's a lot of them, to work the lands for Mephibosheth, which means he's going to be provided for the rest of his life. And he even goes a step farther than that. He even took Mephibosheth into his own family and invited him to eat at his own royal table and treated him just like one of his very own sons, a royal son that he was actually born to be, but that he had lost. Now, that's showing some pretty amazing godlike love and compassion. And Mephibosheth must have been stunned, especially in that day and that culture and the way things usually played out in situations like this. This is so totally, radically different. He must have been shaking his head and pinching himself as this was all unfolding. And there is actually a slightly cynical side of me that wonders, is Mephibosheth thinking that this just might be a trap of some kind? Right? Is he somehow still maybe expecting that the worst might happen? Is David going to stage some accidental death? Is he going to allow one of his overly zealous generals, and there were a number of them, to finish him off? Or maybe is he just going to keep me here kind of as a prisoner to keep an eye on me and make sure that nothing happens and there's no way that I could rise up from this? But David's love proves to be true and honest and genuine, and for years and years and decades, Mephibosheth lives virtually as a member of David's family. For years. You know, really, this is a critical, defining moment in David's life as king of Israel. If there was, he has now secured his kingdom, and it took and united the kingdom. It took quite a while to do that, consolidated his power, and now we see what he's going to do with it. How is he going to deal and wield this power that he has now attained? How will he rule, right? How will he use his authority, and what ambitions will drive him? And here's where we kind of see the direction that David goes. David chooses compassion, love, and grace over things like control and manipulation and paranoia. He chooses to use his power and this gift of authority that he has to love in a great, great way. And here's the thing, David is actually taking a fair bit of risk in doing so. He really is. And he knows it. When David asks if there's anyone left in Saul's family whom he can show love to for the sake of Saul, what he is in effect asking is this: is there anyone left in the enemy camp who I can love and care for? That's effectively what he's asking, right? And in this whole story, there's an even more cynical side of me. Now, that was a cynical side of me. There's an even more cynical side of me that's even more wondering if Mephibosheth ever came fully to peace, with the acceptance of David's love. I mean, I suspect, seriously, if you think about this, I don't think I'm very far off. I suspect that there could well have been a part of him that could have been just a little bit bitter about the way things turned out through that earlier part of his life too. Don't you think? A little bit? I mean, sure, he had wealth restored. That's awesome. And obviously he received that. And he got to eat at the king's table, right? That's quite a privilege. And he's treated as though he's a member of the royal family. But I wonder if he is able to actually be grateful about all of this in a genuine kind of way. Or was there some level of rebellion and resentment that sort of hung on there too from what had happened to him and his family? I mean, after all, here's the thing. After all, it could have been him, right? It could have been him. It could have been his father, Jonathan, who was king. It could have been him that was the heir to the throne. That's what could have been. And, if that were the case, then he wouldn't just be treated like a member of the royal family. He'd be a member of the royal family. In fact, he'd be next in line to the throne. I mean, the one thing that's got to be a lot better than just being with or like a royal family member is to actually be a royal family member. I mean, right? Why be the preposition when you can be the noun? Yeah, that's what it's coming down to. What about that? Instead of just being with the royal family, what about actually being the royal family and the focal member of the royal family? A few times it's mentioned in this passage and in the previous passage that Mephibosheth was crippled, right? That he was lame in both feet. It almost seems to be saying this is kind of a reminder. It says it at the beginning of this passage, and it says it right again at the very end of the passage. It's almost like it's thrown in there twice as this constant reminder. And that's what being lame in both your feet would be. It would be a constant throughout your life reminder that he had fallen, and fallen badly, that his family had fallen, that his house had fallen, that he was broken, and that he had to be restored by the gracious, unfailing kindness of someone else to get back into this story that is the story of the royal family, and that he's now with them. I wonder if Mephibosheth toiled with all of this just a little too much. Just a little too painfully each day as he limped to David's table day after day, or as he needed to be assisted by someone, or maybe even carried to the dining room of King Saul. And no matter how often he ate at the table of the king, you see, he was constantly reminded of the brokenness of his past. Even though he had been restored to some degree, to an amazing degree, he was constantly reminded that it was the unfailing love of David that invited him to be here and nothing else. Nothing else. This was gracious restoration. He was not there by right anymore. He was there by grace. Only David's grace restored him to what he wasn't anymore. Did Mephibosheth, I wonder, battle with that at least some? You know, these sort of inner demons that obsessed, that created some level of obsession in him, brooding quietly over these things in his mind while he was trying to be grateful for them. Could he embrace his weakness, his brokenness, this constant state of grace that he had to now live in? And could he do it joyfully, or did his ego hold him back from that? Did his desires want more than that? Specifically to be the focus, the subject, the noun, the verb of his own story. Right? Did that sometimes get the better of him? Do you see now how this story sort of becomes an allegory, right? It's quite clearly becoming an allegory. Do you see how David becomes a type or an image of God, the King of Kings, in this story, right? And how Mephibosheth becomes a type or an image representing humanity, all of humanity, all of us, fallen, broken, disconnected, and hiding in a desolate place from our God. And please note how it is David who takes all the initiative here. He's the one doing all the action here. He's the one who goes and seeks out Mephibosheth. It's not the other way around. Mephibosheth has this remnant still in him of this royal DNA kind of in his blood, much like we all have sort of the image of our Creator in us, but something's been broken. Something's fallen and crashed. He's of a broken house now. And it's all kind of gone astray from what it was anointed to be, kind of like humanity has. And Mephibosheth finds himself injured and living a rather lost life in kind of a lost town. And the name of the town is Lo-Debar, which literally means a place of no pastures. No pastures. I mean, there's not gardens there. There's not even pasture there. It is a desolate place. And that's where he finds himself. Right? Living in the house of someone else. It's not even his own house. He even sees himself as this sort of dead dog. And two times it emphasizes that he's crippled. It didn't need to. From the beginning of the passage to the end of the passage, we probably remembered that he's crippled. But the author puts it in again as some kind of emphasis. But that's not all he emphasizes, right? 2 times it mentions that, but 3 times, it mentions the kindness of the king toward him. And 4 times, the author chooses to note and to re-emphasize that Mephibosheth ate at the king's table as one of his sons. Just as one of his sons. It's almost like he's trying to out-trump that brokenness with the grace and the love that the king is bestowing upon him. All because of this unfailing kindness that he's dedicated to. And all Mephibosheth has to do is accept and receive the king's kindness. That's all he has to do. And his kindness brings him, just allow this kindness to bring him out of that desolate town and right into the very royal courts and the very royal table of the king himself. Just accept what the king is offering. That's all he has to do. Might it have been humbling? Yeah, I'm sure. In fact, it's kind of designed to be, probably. Likely, it would have soothed Mephibosheth's bruised ego if somehow he could have done something to have earned this. It's like, okay, king, yes, I will, but let me do something to sort of make me feel like I'm earning this. Or if he could have kind of fought his way into acceptance. Maybe I can defeat some enemy for you or something like that. Let me do something to sort of earn this acceptance and privilege to be in the family. But it wasn't like that. It absolutely was not like that. It was all and only grace and the loving kindness of the king that brought him there and nothing else. And you see where I'm going. And that is how it is with God's grace and us, right? Us in a fallen, broken humanity. It is God who takes all the initiative and does all the action. It is his love and his initiative that invites us to his table and into his presence and into his story and gives us privileges as his very own children. It is not because of righteousness that we have done, but because of his mercy that has pursued us, even in the midst of our own troubles and brokenness. It is God who has offered us a place in his kingdom. The Christian life is not about us. It is all about God and him inviting us to join him. It's about what he has done, about his graciousness, about his loving kindness that invites us to be with him. Right? He's the noun of the story. He's the subject of the story. The truth is, right? Here's the truth, is that grace, any story of grace, any story about grace, grace will always say far more about the gracious one than it does about the ones receiving grace. And that's the story of the Christian life. It says more about our God than it does about us. And that's the life that we're called to reflect and imitate to the rest of the world too. So that's kind of the so what part of this. What about that part of this? It's what we're called to do and be to the rest of the world too. That kind of graciousness. Share that kind of a story. A life. We're called to live these lives that show off our God and his graciousness and love. That's what we're called to do. And God's grace means, what does God's grace mean? It means, and what are we supposed to emulate? It means, and we're supposed to emulate, that no mistake we or anybody else can make in life disqualifies us from God's love. That's what it means. God's grace means that no person is beyond redemption. No human stain is beyond cleansing. That's what it means. You see, that's what was extended to us. And that's what we are called to extend and practice to the world around us. And it's a challenging thing to do in a world that so wants to judge people by their behavior. You know, in a world that requires criminals and debtors and moral failures to live in and live with their consequences. But we're not called to emulate the world. We're called to emulate God and His grace. And you know, it occurs to me that grace in our world is irrational. It seems so irrational, that kind of grace. Idealistic, unfair, even unjust in some cases. You see, the whole truth about grace is that it goes beyond justice. Justice is that everybody gets what they deserve. Grace goes beyond justice. And God's grace, it never falters. Its source is endless. It is impartial. And it is always free for all. Grace, it seems to have this incredible way of removing the focus from the ugly. Our ugly. The heinous, the vicious. And it instead turns all attention toward the lovely. It just chooses to do that and be that and reveal that, the lovely and the beautiful and the majestic. Quite amazingly, almost miraculously. That is what God does for us. And that's what He calls us to do for others. And actually, in a commentary on this very passage, Eugene Peter, writing about this very same fact, Eugene Peterson says that we can't live a life more like Jesus by embracing a way of life that is less like Jesus. It makes so much sense, but this is what he means. We got to do this kind of stuff. And when we pray to God, the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that's what we're praying for. We're praying for that kind of stuff to happen. Grace to happen instead of raw justice. That's what we're asking for. And those prayers are answered by us miraculously through the ability of God living that out and being able to do that and live like that. We need to be people like David in this story here. If grace is received like this, if you can picture it, this waterfall, a huge waterfall filling our hands, and then just not filling our hands, but just washing over our entire selves, this flowing waterfall. If that's how we receive grace from God, in that sort of abundance, then we certainly have more than enough to share, is the picture, the idea here. Enough to share, even enough to be daring in how we share it, because it's so endless, risky, and extravagant in how we share it with others. Or how about this? Even we have enough unconditional grace cascading into our own lives as Christians from God that we can even afford to be reckless with how we share that grace with others. Because that's certainly what David was here. He was reckless with his grace towards Mephibosheth. How do I know that? Well, let me finish the story for you. Remember I told you there was 3 places where Mephibosheth is found. I told you 2 of them. Here's the 3rd. This comes years later. Many years later. If you can jump now to the end of King David's rule, near the end anyways, chaos ensues within David's own family. And his son, Absalom, actually rebels against him. Along with some of the generals who side with him, they rebel against David. There is a coup within the family. And David is forced to flee. And all those loyal with David flee with him. Guess who wasn't there? Mephibosheth. And in chapter 16, we read this. David, while he's fleeing, talks to Ziba, who was the caretaker of all of Mephibosheth's household and property and everything. And he says to him, where's your master's grandson? Now he's referring to Saul as his master, his grandson, Mephibosheth. Where's he? And Ziba says this, he is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the house of Israel will give him back his grandfather's kingdom. How's that for a stab in the back? Huh? Jump a few chapters later, or beyond that, Absalom dies in this whole coup attempt. David's restored. And in chapter 19, we read this. Here's David now talking with Mephibosheth. Now that conversation happens. They're back in Jerusalem, and he's talking with Mephibosheth. And he says, well, what's up? And here's what Mephibosheth says. He says, my lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame, he said to himself, I will have my donkey saddled, and I will ride on it with you, so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me and has slandered your servant. Ooh. Who's telling the truth? Huh? Well, that's kind of a big deal, isn't it? Who's telling the truth? And you know what? I actually think that this is perhaps the most telling part of the whole story as far as David goes. I mean, one of these guys is lying. And it would not have been hard for David to find out which one. Not at all. He could have interviewed a few other people. He could have figured this out. He could have gotten to the bottom of this. And he could have executed justice at this point in time. But he doesn't do that. And in the end of it all, he totally does not care who's telling the truth. There is no examination. There is no calling of witnesses. There is no investigation. Instead, he accepts both of them completely and unreservedly back into his household without pursuing anything any further. You see, David's love and his unfailing kindness really is unfailing. I mean, that's what unfailing means. That's what unconditional means. It means no matter what. And he recognizes that God's grace that is pouring into his life too is big enough, large enough to handle this faithlessness, this fecklessness, these lies, this whatever hypocrisy there might be. It's big enough for that. That's what unfailing kindness looks like. And again, when we pray for thy kingdom to come and thy will be done here on earth as it is in heaven, that's what we're praying for. That's what we're praying for. Probably more than almost anything else. And I suspect that David, from the very beginning of this, always knew that loving your enemies was kind of a risky thing to do. And that there was no guarantees that it would be reciprocated. And that unfailing kindness doesn't care about reciprocation. It cares about just being unfailing no matter what. And that's what David is doing. He was showing love because he had made a covenant promise with Jonathan of unfailing kindness, and he was honoring simply nothing more than that promise. What would you have done? Because that's what it always comes down to, right? There's no sense in telling these stories and preaching these sermons if it doesn't come back to us. What about us? Would you continue to love in the face of such rejection, such betrayal, and such hypocrisy? Whew. Would you just leave it? Forget about it? And go on loving and fulfilling all of that covenant? Not laying blame or determining who's lying or even worrying about punishing and getting back? What a challenging covenant to have to fulfill. But you know what? Here's something about David's life too. This is happening at the end now, toward the end of David's life. And you know, here's the thing, that by the later years of David's life, when this betrayal happened, David knew. He had gone through things in which he knew very personally about grace and forgiveness and the unconditionalness of it. About having your sins covered by God rather than yourself. Sins that otherwise would destroy him. David had received that from God. Therefore, he knows that he can extend that to another. Wow. It's kind of a good thing that we're not bound by covenant promises like that, eh? You're laughing. Good. You should. Because the truth is that we are. We are. Let me just review a few of them for you. Love your enemies and pray for those who hate you. That's Jesus, by the way. If anyone strikes you on one cheek, turn to them also the other. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop them from taking your tunic as well. Jesus. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Jesus. There's a few from Paul. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing so, you heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. Well, how about this? Husbands, love your wives. Wives, love your husbands. For better, for worse, sickness, poor, good times, bad. Ooh. Children, honor your parents. Parents, love your children. So, I mean, and how far do we have to go with all of that? I mean, isn't there sort of a practical end to that stuff? How far do we really have to go with all of that? Well, how far did God go with us? I suppose that's the only appropriate answer. How far did he extend that to us? And if we were let off those kinds of hooks by the grace and the covering of God, how can we keep people, other people, on our hooks if they might owe or have offended or hurt us? How far do we have to go? Unfailing kindness, unconditional love. That kind of says it all. I'll wrap up now. Where are we? Yeah. Nelson Mandela. Man, the world lost someone when he passed away not too long ago. I see in this man, I don't know a whole lot about him personally, but I see the actions of Christ and the love of God in him more than almost anybody else who's lived during the time that I've lived on earth. Nelson Mandela, you see, he spent 27 years in prison unjustly. Unjustly. Never charged with an actual crime. Never sentenced to an actual sentence. Just thrown there because he was viewed as an enemy to a regime that was unjust. He was unjustly imprisoned for 27 years of his life. When he was finally released, he was promptly elected president of South Africa. Where does that happen? Where a 27-year felon gets out of jail and boom, he's president. That's not real common in our world. He then appointed Archbishop Desmond Tutu to head up what was known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And he did this also. Here's what he did. He also stipulated, right, that if any white policeman or army official or official of any kind voluntarily faced his accusers, confessed his crimes, and fully acknowledged his guilt, no matter what it was, that person could not be tried and punished for that crime. That's what he was offering. If they came forward and came clean, that's what he was offering. Freedom, completely. And you know what? Many people, when that was first announced, were very upset about that. Many people grumbled tremendously about that. But here's what Mandela's response was. He insisted that this country needs healing more than it needs justice. And it was true. And for that reason alone, South Africa didn't explode when it made its transition from apartheid and, white rule and only white rule to a free and open society that allowed votes for everyone. And of course, it's in Africa. So population-wise, black numbers are far larger than white. So of course, once that was opened up, it swung over to a black-dominated government for the most part, with Mandela, 27 years imprisoned. I mean, how many people must have been going, oh my goodness, we're gonna pay now. We're gonna get the other end of the stick now. And here's what Nelson Mandela does. He does exactly the God thing. He does exactly the Jesus thing. It's like, no, we don't need justice now. We need healing. And healing is only going to come by grace and forgiveness and letting each other go. And under Desmond Tutu's direction, it happened. It happened in an amazing, amazing kind of way. I could tell you more stories, but I'm just overwhelmed today by the graciousness of God and by his unfailing love to me, because I don't deserve this. There's a verse in 2 Timothy chapter 2 where it tells us, where Paul tells us that even when we are faithless, God remains faithful because he cannot and will not disown his own. He won't. And that's a good thing, because I'd have been disowned. I remember a couple years ago driving to through Los Angeles on our way down to Mexico on one of our missions trips, and I'm not a good driver. I mean, I drive okay. I mean, my temperament on the road is not good. I have issues. I have issues. I have emotional issues, mental issues, quite honestly, that caused by repeated brain trauma in my earlier years, and things don't quite function always right for me, and I go off like ballistic sometimes. And driving seems to be one of those things. If you don't believe me, you can ask any member of my family to verify it. And we're driving through LA, and I know LA's hard for me, really, really hard for me. So I set my GPS to take us all the way around LA. It's not going to be a whole lot faster, but at least I can keep moving and it's more peaceful. And we're going to skirt all the way around LA. And I'm driving, I'm following the GPS, and it's quite a long detour. And it's skirting us around and around, and I don't really know where. I'm just trusting the thing, It's what you do with GPSs. And what it did was skirt us all the way out and right back to I-5. Only like 15 miles down the road. I just added an insane amount of time to our drive, and I'm right back, only now I am in the thick of rush hour just before LA, just on the south side of the Grapevine. And I've now got to drive through all of it. And I'm snapping. I'm losing it. And saying things I shouldn't say. And Kim says to me, oh, Roger, you got to calm down. What would Jesus do? It's like, good question, bad timing, And I go on this rant how I'm not Jesus. And I don't care what he would do. I'm done with this, and blah, 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 and almost like denouncing my faith. That's me. And it's such a good thing that there's grace and not just raw, absolute justice. Because I'd be done. It's such a good thing that when we are faithless, he is faithful and he will not disown his own. That is such good news. That's the gospel. And that's what God extends to us. Therefore, we really can extend that to others. We really can, because it's not us. It's not about us, remember? It's about him. He will provide the grace for us to be able to do it. He really covers the whole bill for us. For the grace that we need for ourselves and the grace that we need to give to someone else. He'll cover the whole bill for all of it. He's got it covered. It's almost like he's given us blank checks to spread around. It's like, here guys, go spread these all around the world. Blank checks of grace and forgiveness to anyone who's willing to receive it. Right? Because that's the whole thing. It's all, Nelson Mandela too. It's all about, if you're willing to just come forward and own it, you're free. You just got to accept it. We've got those blank checks, and they're all covered by God through Jesus. So we can do it. We can exercise that, and we're called to exercise that. And I just firmly believe that if the church, even this church, and the church in general just became a place where that was done and practiced, man, the world would beat a path to our door. Because you know what? The world needs healing more than it needs justice. It does. Amen? So Lord, thank you for your goodness and your grace. Oh, God. I mean, we can say that so quickly and so almost thoughtlessly. But my God, my Lord, how overwhelming it is when we pause to really think about it and understand the magnitude of that. Your unconditional love and grace, if we just come to you as you call us, because it's not us seeking you out, it's you calling us. When we respond, how overwhelming and powerful that is. God, open up those floodgates and just pour your grace down upon us as we accept our need for it. As we accept our need for it. And then, Lord, may we just share it extravagantly with our world. Even with risk with our world. Your kingdom come, your will be done, here on earth as it is in heaven. And that's how it is from heaven. Amen. God bless you. We're going to have some people pray over inside here. Just through those doors, there's a little hallway there, a few chairs set up. If you need to pray about something, come and let's pray together. The goodness and the grace of God in our lives. God bless you. Love you. Have a great, great day and a great week. Amen.